Chandeliers glittered like frozen fireworks above the ballroom, every crystal catching the light and scattering it in 1,000 tiny bursts across polished marble floors. Waiters in crisp uniforms carried trays of champagne flutes, weaving through clusters of the city's most powerful and wealthy. Gold and silver sequins glimmered on gowns that brushed against tuxedo trousers and laughter. The expensive kind, the kind born from comfort and arrogance, rose and fell in waves that matched the orchestra's warm hum. It was the Whitmore's annual winter gala, and attendance was less about enjoyment and more about being seen. Standing on the far side of the room, almost blending into the wallpaper, was Amara. Her uniform was spotless black dress, white apron, hair tied back neatly, eyes lowered just enough to avoid offense, but never so low she couldn't anticipate a guest's need. She balanced a tray of glasses like she had done countless times before, each step measured, careful, silent. No one saw her, or at least no one cared to see her, except when she hesitated a second too long in collecting an empty glass or refilling a flute. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore noticed, though. She noticed everything. A widow who had inherited both fortune and social standing from her late husband, Mrs. Whitmore had the kind of commanding presence that could silence a room with just the tilt of her head, draped in emerald silk and diamonds that caught every drop of light. She walked with her chin tilted slightly higher than everyone else, as if the air were purer where she breathed. Her son, Daniel, stood beside her, a tall man with kind eyes, but his voice was often lost in his mother's shadow. As the orchestra shifted into a waltz, Mrs. Whitmore's gaze wandered across the floor. Couples twirled, skirts fanned, polished shoes glided in perfect patterns. And then, as though struck by a spark of cruelty disguised as humor, her eyes landed on Amara, who was quietly setting a tray down by the edge of the ballroom. The corners of her mouth curled into a smirk that promised mischief, the kind of mischief that only those secure in power dared to indulge. My, she said loudly, her voice carrying farther than she pretended it would. All these young women desperate for a dance with my son, and yet I think none could match the elegance of our little maid here. The cluster of guests around her burst into laughter, their jeweled shoulders shaking, their polished teeth flashing. Amara froze, her back stiffening as heat flooded her face. She didn't look up. She knew better. The more invisible she stayed, the safer she was. But Mrs. Whitmore wasn't finished. Cruelty demanded an audience, and she had one. She raised her glass, eyes glittering with a challenge that wasn't truly meant to be answered. In fact, she continued, turning her voice into a theatrical proclamation. If you dance this waltz,
you marry my son.
The words sliced through the air. Gasps and giggles exploded around the ballroom. Someone clapped sarcastically. Another woman whispered behind her fan. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. His mother's games had long been his burden. All eyes turned toward Amara. She felt them pierce her skin, dozens of gazes heavy with mockery and disbelief. In that moment, she wasn't a person to them. She was a prop in a cruel joke, a servant plucked from the shadows to provide entertainment. Her hands trembled around the tray, but she forced them still. She had lived through humiliation before. She had swallowed pride. She had endured whispers. She had endured hunger and loss and disappointment. What was one more laugh at her expense? And yet, something inside her quivered. Not with fear, but with an ache she tried to bury long ago. The orchestra continued its waltz, as though mocking her too, each sweeping note pulling at memories she thought she had locked away. Memories of music halls and competitions, of satin shoes and graceful spins, of applause that once belonged to her. Before life had torn her from that stage. Before her world had collapsed under the weight of responsibilities she had never asked for. She tried to look away from the dance floor, but her eyes betrayed her, following the elegant couples as they moved in synchrony. Her chest tightened. She could almost feel the floor beneath her feet, almost hear her instructor's voice correcting her posture, almost taste the sweetness of victory that once defined her. But here she was, reduced to carrying drinks for people who mocked her, pretending not to hear, pretending not to feel. She shifted her weight, biting down on the inside of her cheek until the metallic tang of blood grounded her. The laughter hadn't stopped. It swirled around her like smoke, choking, relentless. Mrs. Whitmore raised an eyebrow. "Well?" she pressed, feigning amusement. "Surely you know how to dance. Or is polishing silver the only rhythm you've mastered?" The crowd roared with laughter again, some covering their mouths, others letting it ring out freely. Amara wanted to vanish into the walls. She wanted to put down her tray and disappear into the kitchen, where the air was warm with steam and spices, where at least the stairs were absent. But she couldn't move. Her feet felt nailed to the marble. Her chest rose and fell too quickly, as though the very act of breathing had become treacherous. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low but audible. "Mother, that's enough." Mrs. Whitmore waved him off with a dismissive flick of her jeweled hand. "Nonsense. It's just harmless fun." Her eyes returned to Amara, sharp and unyielding. "Come now, girl, one little dance. Show us what you've got." Every part of Amara screamed to say no, to shake her head, to lower her gaze and refuse. Yet somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of humiliation and fear, a small ember glowed. The ember of who she used to be. The ember of a champion who once stood on stages, who once heard her name spoken with respect, who once felt alive when music carried her across a floor, just like this one. The guests were waiting, hungry for more laughter. The waltz swelled, violin sweeping higher, cellos grounding the melody. The rhythm called to her, even as the mocking stares pushed her away. Amara's fingers tightened around the edge of the tray. She lifted her eyes for the first time, not high enough to meet Mrs. Whitmore's, but just enough to glimpse the couple spinning across the floor, to glimpse Daniel standing still at the edge, to glimpse the impossible cruelty of this moment that balanced so precariously between humiliation and revelation. And in that fragile pause, in that single breath, where silence seemed to stretch across the room, despite the music and the laughter, Amara felt the weight of every choice she had made, that had brought her here, standing in this ballroom, wearing this uniform, trapped in someone else's cruel amusement. The laughter of the ballroom still rang in Amara's ears, long after the sound itself had faded, echoing inside her chest like a cruel refrain. Her hands were steady again, but only because she forced them to be. Years of practice had taught her that the smallest tremor, the faintest show of weakness, could draw more eyes to her than she could bear. A servant's strength lay not in being noticed, but in blending so completely into the background that she became as invisible as the wallpaper, as silent as the chandeliers swaying gently above. But as she stood at the edge of the dance floor, staring at the polished marble that reflected the light in dazzling shards, she could not silence the storm that churned within. They thought she was nothing. They thought she was only a maid, some quiet girl brought here to clear plates and polish glasses. And on the surface, perhaps they were right. That was what she was now, what she had become out of necessity. But there had been a time, not so long ago though it felt like another lifetime, when her name had been announced on stages, when cameras had flashed in her direction, when applause had filled entire halls after she and her partner bowed deeply at the end of a flawless routine. Amara had been born into little. Her parents worked tirelessly, her mother as a seamstress, her father as a driver. They had little money, but poured everything they had into their only child, seeing in her the spark of something extraordinary. When she was a girl, she would dance barefoot in their small living room, twirling to songs her mother hummed while the sewing machine rattled in the corner. Her father, tired from long days on the road, would clap softly and tell her she moved like the wind. Those were the first audiences she ever had, the first ones to tell her she was meant for more than her circumstances allowed. A scholarship to a small dance academy had been the miracle that changed everything. There, she was no longer just Amara, the daughter of poor parents. She was a prodigy. Teachers marveled at the way her body bent and swayed as though music lived in her bones. She learned quickly, her dedication sharper than hunger, her discipline forged by the knowledge that failure meant going back to a life of scarcity. She practiced until her toes bled, until her muscles ached so badly she could hardly walk home. But every hour paid off. Every sacrifice carved her into someone greater, someone whose name began to spread beyond the academy. By the time she was 18, Amara was not just another student. She was the rising star of her country's dance competitions, gliding across stages with a grace that made judges lean forward and audiences hold their breath. The waltz had been her specialty, not the stiff, mechanical kind, but a living, breathing waltz where each turn was a conversation between her and the music. She had a partner then, a tall boy with quick feet and a steady frame, and together they were nearly unstoppable. Competition after competition, they rose to the top, their names etched on trophies, their faces appearing in local newspapers. She remembered the feel of those evenings, the adrenaline, the tension, the silence before the music began. She remembered stepping onto the stage in satin shoes, the lights warming her skin, the crowd just a blur of faces lost in the shadows. And she remembered the joy, the absolute joy, of moving in perfect harmony with the music, her body telling stories without words, her soul lifting with every step. She remembered the applause at the end, the flood of sound washing over her like sunlight, the pride in her parents' faces as they watched from the sidelines. For a time, she had believed that was her destiny. But life does not ask what destiny we prefer. Life chooses for us. When her father fell ill, the family's fragile finances collapsed. Hospital bills mounted. The sponsorships and prize money that had once sustained her were not enough to save him, and Amara was forced to make a choice: chase her dreams or hold her family together. She chose family. She always would. Her father died within the year, leaving her and her mother drowning in debt. Her mother's hands, once quick with needle and thread, grew slower with arthritis. The studio fees became impossible. Her partner found a new dancer, someone without obligations, someone free to compete. The spotlight dimmed until it vanished altogether, and Amara, who had once moved like wind, grounded herself in the harsh soil of necessity. When an opportunity came to work abroad, she took it, not because it was glamorous, but because it promised stability. A cousin arranged the position in America, a country she had only dreamed of, a place where, she thought, maybe one day she could find her way back to the stage. The reality was humbler, harder. She worked as a maid in the Whitmore estate, her days spent dusting chandeliers she would never dine beneath, polishing glasses she would never drink from, and serving food she could hardly afford for herself. She learned to smile politely, to nod at commands, to silence the music in her veins. The Whitmores paid well compared to anything she could have earned at home. And that money went straight to her mother, who now lived quietly in a small apartment, grateful for her daughter's sacrifice. Amara told herself it was worth it, that dignity could be postponed, that dreams could wait. But they never truly disappeared. They lingered in her body, in her muscle memory, in the way her hips swayed slightly when she walked, in the way her fingers tapped against countertops when she heard a rhythm. Sometimes, when no one was watching, she would close her eyes in the servants' quarters and let her body remember. A spin here, a glide there, just enough to remind herself she was still that girl, even if the world had forgotten. And now, in this ballroom, filled with glittering gowns and arrogant laughter, those memories came crashing back. Mrs. Whitmore's mockery had been meant as a joke, a cruel dismissal. But to Amara it was a summons she had not expected. The waltz pouring from the orchestra was the same rhythm she had danced to 100 times, the same steps she had once executed with precision and grace. Every note tugged at her, whispering, urging, demanding. Her chest rose and fell as the weight of her past pressed against the humiliation of her present. They thought she was only a maid. They thought she had no place among them, that her body was made only for labor, not art. But deep within her, behind years of silence and sacrifice, the champion stirred. The applause, the trophies, the pride, they lived within her still, a hidden flame waiting for oxygen. The guests kept staring, their laughter sharp as broken glass, their whispers swirling like smoke. Daniel's eyes flicked toward her, softer than the rest, filled not with mockery but with something else, something she couldn't name. Her palms were damp. Her heart pounded with the force of a drum. She felt as though she were standing on two stages at once, the present one, cruel and mocking, and the stage of her memory, bathed in golden light, the orchestra swelling, the crowd breathless with anticipation, her body alive with the knowledge that she was about to take flight. The waltz drifted through the ballroom like a tide, slow at first, steady, patient, then sweeping higher, carrying with it a sense of inevitability. Every note seemed to tug at Amara, as though invisible strings were tied from the violins directly to her chest. She stood at the edge of the dance floor, her tray still balanced carefully in her hands, her breath shallow, her heartbeat impossibly loud. The mocking eyes of the guests pressed against her skin, their laughter curling around her like smoke, stinging, suffocating. But beneath the sting there was something else, something fiercer. The rhythm, so familiar, had awakened the part of her that she had long buried. Her body remembered the music in ways her mind had tried to forget. It remembered the rise and fall of her shoulders, the gentle sway of her arms, the confidence in each glide. The urge to move rose within her like a tide, stronger than the humiliation, stronger even than fear. She felt her chest tighten as she glanced across the floor. Couples twirled in perfect form, their gowns fanning out like blossoms, their polished shoes sliding across marble that gleamed like water. They looked effortless, elegant, untouchable. And yet, Amara knew, she knew in her bones, that she had once danced better than any of them. She had once held audiences in silence, their eyes wide, their breath stolen by the grace she summoned with every turn. Mrs. Whitmore's voice rang out again, sharp, slicing through the music. "Well, Maid, what's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or perhaps your feet don't know left from right?" The crowd erupted once more. Some laughed outright, others leaned in to whisper, enjoying the spectacle. Amara lowered her gaze briefly, her tray heavy in her hands. She could walk away. She could slip quietly into the kitchen, let their laughter roll over her, pretend none of this mattered. That was the safe choice, the expected choice. It was what a maid would do. But she was not just a maid. Not entirely, not forever. Her hands trembled once before she set the tray down carefully on a side table. The crystal glasses rattled lightly against each other, drawing a hush of curiosity from those nearest. She straightened her spine slowly, her shoulders rolling back, her chin lifting a fraction. And then she did something she hadn't dared to do in years. She stepped forward, away from the shadows, toward the center of the ballroom. A ripple of surprise swept through the crowd. Whispers rose, sharp and incredulous. Mrs. Whitmore's smirk faltered, her lips parting slightly as she realized her joke had taken a direction she had not intended. Daniel's eyes widened too, though in them was not mockery, but a strange flicker of recognition, as though he sensed something in her that the others had not yet seen. Amara's pulse thundered in her ears. Every instinct screamed that this was madness, that she was placing herself in the middle of their cruel spectacle. But another voice, softer, deeper, older, whispered that this was her chance, perhaps the only one she would ever have, to remind herself of who she truly was. The orchestra played on, oblivious to the tension thickening in the air. The violins sang, the piano chimed, the cellos carried the weight of the melody. Amara closed her eyes briefly, inhaling deeply. She imagined herself years ago, standing on a very different floor, the lights bright and warm, her heart pounding not from fear, but from exhilaration. She remembered the first note of a performance, that sharp, glorious moment when everything else fell away, and there was only the music and her body's response to it. She opened her eyes, and then she moved. It began with a single step, deliberate and poised, her slippered foot sliding across the marble with a grace that made the nearest guests fall silent. She lifted her arm with a fluidity that spoke of training, of discipline, of countless hours spent perfecting every line. Then she spun, her skirt catching the light, and the crowd gasped audibly. The laughter was gone. The ballroom, once buzzing with derision, grew hushed as her body took command of the space. Each movement was precise, measured, yet alive with a passion that none of the other dancers possessed. She was not simply following steps. She was telling a story with every turn, every glide, every extension of her hands. The music poured through her, and she gave it form, shape, meaning. Her body remembered everything. The rise onto her toes, the slight arch of her back, the perfect timing of her pivots. She was no longer Amara the maid, invisible and silent. She was Amara the dancer, the champion, the girl who had once made entire rooms fall still. She had thought she had buried that girl forever, but here she was, alive again, breathing through her movements, igniting the air with her presence. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Fans lowered. Glasses of champagne were forgotten in astonished hands. Couples slowed their own steps just to watch her, their polished routines paling beside the raw, undeniable artistry unfolding before them. Mrs. Whitmore's smirk had vanished entirely now, replaced with a look of disbelief that hardened into something sharper. Fear, perhaps, or rage at losing control of her own narrative. She had wanted a joke, an easy laugh at a servant's expense. Instead, she had given the maid a stage, and the maid had taken it. Daniel could not look away. His chest swelled with something he hadn't expected. Pride, admiration, awe. He had known Amara only as quiet, efficient, careful in her duties. But this was a revelation. Every movement she made was poetry, every turn a declaration of strength and beauty. She was not small, not invisible. She was extraordinary. Amara spun once more, the hem of her skirt swirling out like a wave, then slowed, gliding into a perfect series of steps that matched the waltz's rhythm so seamlessly it seemed the music had been written for her alone. The crowd was utterly silent now, their earlier mockery transformed into rapt attention. The only sound was the orchestra, swelling and lifting as though it too recognized that something remarkable was unfolding. Her chest rose and fell, her face calm, her eyes burning with a light that had been hidden for too long. This was what she had been born for. This was the language she spoke best, the truth of who she was. Every movement reminded her, and everyone else, that dignity could not be stripped away by uniforms or cruel words. It lived in her body, in her art. The waltz neared its climax, the strings soaring higher, the tempo quickening slightly. Amara's body responded instinctively, each step more daring, each turn more dazzling. She extended her arm in one final arc, her posture impeccable. Her face lifted toward the chandeliers as though she were reaching not just for the music, but for the very life she had lost. And as the music swelled to its peak, the ballroom, filled with people who had once mocked her, who had dismissed her as nothing, watched in stunned, breathless silence, unable to deny the truth standing before them in every graceful, defiant movement. For a long moment after the last note faded, the ballroom stood still, as though the music lingered in the very air, unwilling to let go. Amara's final pose, poised and dignified, seemed to hold the entire room captive. Every breathless guest, every jeweled matron, every tuxedoed gentleman, all of them were suspended in a silence they had not expected to feel. The same people who moments ago had been laughing, mocking, cruel, now stared with wide eyes, their amusement erased, replaced by awe they did not want to admit. It was Daniel who moved first. He had watched from the beginning, from the moment his mother's sharp words turned Amara into the night's cruel entertainment. At first, he had felt only shame, not for her, but for them, for the people he was supposed to belong among, for the mother who wore arrogance as though it were silk. He had wanted to step in, to pull Amara away, to shield her from their laughter. But then she had placed her tray down and walked forward, and something in him had stilled. He had felt it in his chest, like the hush before a storm, a quiet that promised something powerful. And when she began to dance, Daniel's world shifted. He had been raised among beauty. Artwork hung in gilded frames on the walls of his home. Music played nightly by orchestras like the one tonight. Women in gowns that cost more than most men's annual salaries. But never had he seen beauty like this. Amara's dance was not decoration, not performance for performance's sake. It was a revelation. It was truth. He saw it in the precision of her steps, in the unbreakable grace of her posture, in the fire in her eyes. He saw it in the way her body spoke, even when her lips did not, in the way she turned humiliation into art and silence into thunder. Every second he watched her, Daniel felt something unfurl inside him, something that had been asleep for far too long. He had lived in a cage gilded by wealth and expectation. His mother dictated his movements as if his life were a chessboard on which he was just another piece. He had grown used to it, numb to it. But watching Amara, he remembered that there was more. More to see, more to feel, more to live for. The applause broke suddenly, bursting from the silence like water behind a dam. It began hesitantly, from someone in the back who could no longer hold their astonishment in. Then another joined, and another, until the room filled with clapping, a thunderous sound that echoed off the marble and crystal, reverberating into every corner of the hall. Guests rose to their feet, the same ones who had mocked her only minutes before, now compelled to acknowledge what they had just witnessed. Amara lowered her arms slowly, her chest rising and falling with the weight of exertion and emotion. Her eyes glistened faintly, though no tear fell. She had not danced for them. She had not danced for applause. She had danced because she could not do otherwise, because the music demanded it, because her very soul had demanded it. Daniel stepped forward. He moved past the chairs, past the astonished faces of men and women who turned to watch him. His steps were firm, his gaze fixed. When he reached her, she looked up, startled, her lips parting as though to apologize, to retreat back into the shadows where she believed she belonged. But he did not let her. He extended his hand, palm open, fingers steady, a quiet invitation. "For me," he said softly, his voice low enough that it seemed meant only for her, though the room strained to hear. "Dance again. With me." The word stunned her. For a heartbeat, she did not move, caught between disbelief and fear. She glanced around at the guests, their jeweled eyes wide, their whispers rising like a tide. She knew what they were thinking. A maid dancing with the millionaire's son. Unthinkable, outrageous, impossible. And yet here he was, his hands still extended, his eyes filled not with pity or condescension, but with admiration so clear it made her breath hitch. Her hand trembled as she placed it in his. His grip was warm, firm, steadying. The orchestra, as though guided by fate, began another waltz, the first notes curling into the air like a promise. Daniel guided her gently, respectfully, his posture as formal as the finest gentleman's, but his expression soft, almost reverent, and then they moved. At first, Amara was cautious, her body stiff with the awareness of every eye in the room. But Daniel's presence was different. He was not mocking her, not testing her, not waiting for her to falter. He was with her, matching her steps, meeting her halfway. She realized quickly he was no trained dancer. His footwork was imperfect, his timing slightly off. But he followed her lead, and in doing so, he gave her something she had not expected: freedom. She relaxed into the movement, and once again, the fire caught within her. She guided him gently, her body steering his without force, just trust. And he trusted her utterly, surrendering to the rhythm, to her command of it, to the way she transformed even his clumsy steps into part of something greater. Together, they moved across the floor, their bodies a dialogue, her grace and his sincerity weaving into something undeniable. The ballroom was silent again, not because the music was soft, but because every guest was watching, transfixed. They saw not a maid and a millionaire's son, but two souls meeting in the only language that mattered. Mrs. Whitmore's face had gone pale. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her jeweled hand clutching her glass so tightly that the stem threatened to snap. This was not how her joke was supposed to end. She had wanted to humiliate the girl, to elevate her own status by cutting another down. Instead, her son was on the floor with her, not as though bound by mockery, but as though drawn by something real. Something stronger than her influence. The dance swelled. Amara turned beneath Daniel's arm, her skirt flaring, her steps effortless. He steadied her with a hand at her back, his eyes never leaving hers. In that gaze she saw something she had not dared hope for recognition. Not of her station, not of her duty, but of her humanity, her strength, her beauty. It startled her, unsettled her, but it also filled her with warmth she had nearly forgotten existed. Each spin, each glide, carried more weight than steps alone. They carried a revelation. Daniel had not only seen her dance, he had seen her, truly seen her. And in that seeing, something within him shifted. He no longer cared about the whispers, the scandal his mother's circle would surely spin. He no longer cared about what was proper, what was expected. All he cared about was the woman in his arms, who had turned his mother's cruel jest into a triumph, who had reminded him that life was more than wealth and appearances. The orchestra rose toward its crescendo, and Daniel tightened his hold, guiding her into one final, sweeping turn. The room gasped as she spun, her body a blur of grace and light, and when she came to rest, he caught her, steadying her effortlessly. Their faces were inches apart now, their breath mingling, their eyes locked in a silence louder than any applause. Around them, the ballroom erupted, clapping, shouting, the sound echoing off marble and crystal once more. But Daniel did not hear it. Neither did Amara. For them, the world had narrowed to this moment, this connection, this revelation that neither could deny. The applause thundered across the ballroom, but it sounded different now. It was no longer the brittle, mocking kind of clapping reserved for a joke at someone else's expense. It was genuine, uncontainable, as though the very walls themselves had been forced to acknowledge what had just unfolded. The same guests who had sneered at Amara now leaned forward in awe, their jeweled hands striking together, their voices rising above the orchestra in cries of astonishment. Amara, her chest heaving softly with the remnants of exertion, still felt Daniel's hand against hers, warm and steady. She tried to ground herself in that warmth, but her mind swirled, her heart caught between disbelief and something that felt dangerously like hope. She had meant only to prove, to herself more than anyone, that she was more than what they saw. She had not expected this storm of applause, this standing ovation, this quiet, unshakable way. Daniel's eyes lingered on her as though the entire world had shifted. Mrs. Whitmore's face was a study in contradictions. Anger flickered there, sharp and hot, but it was shadowed by something else: confusion, maybe even shame. She had not imagined that her cruel little jest could unravel like this, exposing not just her arrogance, but the emptiness of the hierarchy she clung to so tightly. All her wealth, her influence, her polished reputation, none of it could stop the truth of what had just happened. A maid had stepped into her glittering ballroom and, with nothing but the strength of her body and the fire in her soul, conquered it. Amara turned slightly, as if to retreat, to slip back into invisibility before the weight of their stares became unbearable again. But Daniel did not release her hand. He held her gently but firmly, anchoring her, reminding her without words that what had just been born between them was not something to hide. The orchestra, sensing the moment, let the final notes linger, fading into silence. Then Daniel did something no one in that room expected. He dropped to one knee, right there on the polished marble floor, his hand still holding Amara's. Gasps tore through the crowd, sharp and breathless, followed by a rising tide of murmurs. Some clutched their pearls, others leaned forward, eyes wide with shock. Mrs. Whitmore's hand flew to her chest, her diamonds trembling against her gown. Amara's eyes widened, her lips parting in disbelief. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel looked up at her, his eyes steady, his jaw firm, his voice loud enough for every person in that hall to hear. "What I should have done the moment you stepped onto this floor," he said. "What I should have done long before tonight. I don't care what uniform you wear, what others call you, or where you came from. I care about the truth I saw tonight, the truth of who you are. Strong, graceful, extraordinary. I won't pretend otherwise. Not anymore." The room erupted again, this time with voices raised in disbelief, excitement, scandal. The millionaire's son, on one knee before a maid, speaking words of reverence as though she were a queen. Amara's heart raced, her mind spinning. She had faced humiliation, ridicule, endless sacrifice, but never had she faced this: a man seeing her not as less, but as equal, as something precious, as someone worth choosing in front of everyone. Mrs. Whitmore's voice finally cut through the noise, sharp as glass.
"Daniel, get up this instant!"
"Have you lost your senses?" He did not look at her. His gaze never wavered from Amara. "No, mother," he said firmly. "For the first time in years, I feel like I've found them." The crowd buzzed louder, scandal mixing with wonder. Some of the older guests shook their heads, muttering about disgrace, about propriety, about the Whitmore legacy being tarnished. Others, especially the younger ones, looked on with something like admiration, their eyes bright with the thrill of seeing tradition shattered in real time. Amara's throat tightened. This was not a fairy tale. She knew the world outside this ballroom would not suddenly soften because of a single dance. She knew whispers would follow, harsh and relentless, and that stepping into Daniel's world would mean battles she was not sure she could win. But standing there, watching him kneel before her without shame, she felt something ignite within her, a courage she had thought long extinguished. Her life had been defined by sacrifice, by choosing duty over dreams, silence over defiance, invisibility over expression. But here was someone asking her to be seen, fully, without apology. The thought terrified her, but it also filled her with a kind of hope so fierce it made her chest ache. The applause did not stop. It rolled on, relentless, like waves crashing against a shore that had been waiting centuries to be touched. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, overcome. A man who had mocked Amara earlier now clapped the loudest, as if to hide his shame in noise. Mrs. Whitmore's face was ashen now, her lips pressed tight, her eyes burning with fury she could not unleash without further humiliating herself. She wanted to snap, to pull her son up by the arm, to drag him away and erase this spectacle. But she knew it was too late. The story had already written itself, and every person in that room would carry it out into the city by morning. Amara felt her knees weaken, her vision blurring slightly from the weight of it all. But Daniel's eyes steadied her, pulling her back, reminding her that she was not standing alone. She had walked onto this floor in humiliation, but now she stood in triumph, not because the crowd had cheered, not because the wealthy had been forced to acknowledge her, but because she had remembered herself, because she had chosen to dance. The murmurs swelled again, voices rising, questions flying through the air like sparks. Would she take his hand? Would she dare? Could a maid truly stand beside a millionaire's son as anything other than servant? Amara looked down at him, at the man who had always seemed quiet in his mother's shadow, now blazing with conviction. And in his eyes, she saw no mockery, no pity, no hesitation, only truth, only choice, only the revelation of someone who had finally understood what mattered. The ballroom seemed to tilt, the chandeliers above blurring into stars, the marble beneath her feet gleaming like a stage she had never expected to stand on again. Every breath she had taken that night, every step, every memory of sacrifice and loss and resilience had led her here, to this moment, where she was no longer invisible, no longer hidden, no longer mocked. And as the crowd leaned closer, waiting, whispering, hearts pounding, the weight of transformation hung in the air, so heavy it could almost be touched, pressing down on everyone who had witnessed the impossible become undeniable before their very eyes.